reading recovery lesson begin?
Well, it begins with easy reading. And we use a wide range of little books, little story books. Each child has a box like this that's filled with books, probably about 20 in that box at any one time. And they'll read 3 or maybe 4 at the beginning of each of the sessions. Sometimes the child chooses which ones they want, or the teacher chooses. It's an alternate way of doing that. In that box and within that range of easy reading that they're going to do in the lesson, there's some books which are very, very familiar, some that they've read 2 or 3 weeks ago and read lots of times since then. There are some that are more recent, they've just been introduced maybe a week or so ago, and so you have a range of material. It's all easy, it's all familiar, but there's a range within that. And sometimes, out of that box, the children choose one they want to take home. So they're taking home easy reading to share with the family. Let's look at some teachers and some children doing easy reading. Can you explain why we do easy reading?
Well, there are lots of advantages in it. The easy text gives the child a chance to practice all the reading strategies that they've learned so far. To put some of the complicated behaviours together, which I sometimes call orchestrating the reading behaviours. To do fluent reading right from the very beginning. And it's interesting to see the children in lots of different ways. They seem to show that they feel they're in control of the situation when they're reading those very easy books. I think that's an important facet of it. And then it's an example of 2 different kinds of reading experiences which I think are important. One kind is on easy text where you put everything together. Quite a different kind of reading experience is reading new text where you have to try to do new things you've never done before. But that isn't all that reading is. A lot of reading is reading familiar text and just getting the messages from it in a fluent, easy way. But after the easy books, the lesson moves on and the child reads yesterday's new book.
That's right.
Could you explain yesterday's new book? That's a funny label.
Yesterday's new book is really the second reading of that book, which was introduced the day before. Firstly, the teacher has chosen very carefully a book that she's going to introduce to the child and that the child will read once. Then, on this next day or in the next session, she's going to take a running record of that book. So it's the second reading of the book introduced the day before and read once by the child. And the teacher uses that. After the familiar reading, she moves into observing the child reading that book.
But the teacher takes a running record on this yesterday's book when the child's reading it, doesn't she?
She does. And that's a very different role. In this instance, she doesn't do any teaching. She has to move to the role of neutral observer. And she takes the record, observing what the child's doing while they're reading, and then at the end of that record, sometimes she might return to check on an error or to teach on some success the child has had. For instance, she might say something like, "I like the way you worked on this."
Yes. Here's a child reading yesterday's new book, and the teacher's ready to take a running record. And here's the teacher who's taking that running record of the second reading of the book.
And that will be usually read with 90% accuracy or better.
That's usual, yes. Okay, at this point in the lesson, the teacher has to make some choices, doesn't she, or some decisions, because she's got quite a lot of information on the child. What are her options at this point?
Well, she may have to discard that book. One would hope she didn't. One would hope that the day before she had
She'd made a
noticed
good
that
choice.
Yes, and that if the child was having difficulty on the first reading, she at that point discarded it.
Yes.
So we would hope that would be picked up the day before.
Right.
The book would then go into the box, possibly, and be read again the next day, and then gradually become more and more familiar and become one of the easy books over time. She may decide to, at that time, as we discussed earlier, go back and work on a problem, or she may later in the lesson return to a problem in that book, or use it to come back to the next day.
Mm-hmm. Barbara, children in USA know a lot about letters, and so it's not quite as important as this section is not quite as important as it is for children in New Zealand, who don't seem to know as much about letters. But some children here have to do work on letters, don't they?
That's right, and usually we do that on the magnetic board. This is this child started with very little letter knowledge, and the teacher would probably just select out a few, and I've just put an example here. Some of the ones that she knows, and so she's going to do some revision. In this instance, they're just lowercase letters, but she may well get her to quickly identify them, and then she might muddle them up and identify them again. She keeps a small number, just trying to make sure that the child is very familiar with those ones. And then she may well introduce a new letter, and this little girl's name is Susan, and so she's decided to introduce the N out of her name. It's coming from a meaningful situation, and she would do some work on that N, and then maybe move to other settings and do other things.
There are lots of other things that can be done with letters,
right.
aren't there? Let's look at some of the other activities.
Here's the child's own alphabet book that the teacher's made for her with the letters in that she now knows. Sometimes teachers use trade alphabet books and magnetic work at the table on a very few specifically chosen letters, and using sand to practice letter formation in. Now this part of the lesson, of course, only is used for a very short time at the beginning of the child's program while the child needs letter work, and when they don't need that any longer, it's not part of the lesson.
Well, there's a writing section to every lesson because writing is important for reading, and reading seems to be important for writing. What's the most important thing about the beginning of this writing section?
Well, firstly, the story must be the child's. So the teacher would help him to produce a story by maybe saying, do you have something in your head you'd like to write about? Or she might know of something interesting that's happened in the classroom and suggest he might like to write about that. She might help him to get the story from a favourite story book that he's just read, or a favourite part of a book, or maybe something he's seen on television. But what she's wanting is the child to think up his own story, his own sentence probably.
And sometimes that's quite hard, getting that story from the child, but it's very important. All right. Now, let's suppose that the child's story was, my dog jumped up on Mum's couch. And here's our story. Now, how would the teacher work on that with the child?
Well, first of all, the child probably knows how to write my, so the child would write my. Dog is a little tricky because the child might rush into dog and get that round the wrong way with the D's and the G. So the teacher may well, on the practice page or the work page up above, because they're using a blank book sideways. The lower part is where the child's going to actually write the story. The upper part is the work page or the practice page. She might quickly draw 3 boxes for him and suggest he says it slowly while he puts the letters in. And then he writes that down into his story.
My dog. Right.
My dog, so far. They come to jumped, and she might say, let's work on jump first. And this time she may again use boxes, but very carefully draw them, and she's helping him to hear the sounds in this word and record what he knows in it. So she would draw the boxes, model the word slowly for him, have him say it, and then ask, what can you hear?
And he says, P.
Or P. And she says, put it in, because she in fact knows he can write. She may say, where does it go, depending on where the child says. Then she says, what else can you hear? And this time he heard the J, which he wrote in. And she would finish off the word for him and then add the ED and maybe make a teaching point there.
Why would she finish off that word for him?
Because at the stage he's at, I'm hypothesising that he's at an early stage, he is not able to write any more of that, and he just heard those 2 parts of that word, and that was sufficient to work on.
That was good for him.
That was good for him, and that was sufficient.
Okay.
Up, he knows, but at that point he might, after working on jumped, he may go back and read the story from the beginning, or she may suggest he does, so the story is kept in his head, or the sentence, and he can write up. Then they come to on, and he pauses, he's a bit uncertain, and she decides to use this word as one to help him to learn how to write. It's a word that comes up a lot of times. She wants him to learn to write it every time he comes to it. So she helps him write that word on the practice page, and then they take it to fluency, writing it many times there, going over to the blackboard, writing it again, so he can gets to the stage where he can write that because he really knows it, and he comes back, writes it in the story.
How many times would you have to do it to take it to fluency?
Well, it depends, but it's a lot of times quickly. It's not just once or twice, because that's not going to become learned in the sense of overlearning. You want him to be sure that he knows how to write it. So it may be 6 times very quickly, but it's not a long, laborious process. It's quick. And just trying to have the child have it in his head so he knows how to, that he knows how
And
to
it's
write.
not all on the practice page. It's usually somewhere else.
A good opportunity to move. The blackboard is very good for this because you can rub out quickly and try it again. And then you're asking the child to check as you're doing that he's got it right and so on.
Okay.
Back to the story, probably reading it through from the beginning. Mom's good one for boxes, so she may help him to get what he can hear in boxes. He can probably get most of that. Helps him with the middle. And then she will actually write couch in the story for him. It's too difficult to work on.
So the teacher can work in the child's story
of course,
as well?
using the same coloured pen that he's used, and it becomes a combined effort at the early stages.
And having done all that, he gets a chance to read it again. Perhaps he might read it twice. And so his writing leads to reading, and it's easy reading because he's reading a message which he's already constructed. Let's have a look at some slides of another child a child who's writing a story.
This child's a little further along, and we can see there that he has worked, obviously can write worked on white on the practice page, and he is able to work through the word in sequence now. And he's worked on puppy also, probably used the counters which we can see, and now he's writing that into his story. They've moved on to the next word, and obviously Trevor has heard and been able to write a lot in jumped, and he's managed to hear the D on the end. But now the teacher's helping him with that ED just by talking about and putting in that last letter for him, and then the child will write that word into his story. And now, just to get the story back in his head, Trevor's rereading it.
You can see him doing that.
We've just been looking at the child writing the story. He would have finished that off, and then the teacher would have written it out on a long strip of card and cut it up so the child can reassemble it. Here we see the cutting up process. Here he is sorting out the words and putting the sentence back together again. And it's a very good feeling when you've done that, and we can see the successful achievement of that task.
He knows he's finished. He's done it properly, doesn't he? Yes. This activity that we've been watching, it provides opportunities for the child to monitor their own reading and to search for the words they need, check whether they've got them in the right place, choose between words, which calls for discriminating differences in words that look something alike, and if you get a mistake, correcting it. So that's self-correction in writing.
And the child's checking that against the story that he thought of and he wrote.
Yes.
In reading recovery, why did you include the work in boxes?
The words in boxes. Well, when we first observed children working with teachers to try and work out what their difficulties were, we found that while some children could read letters and tell us what the sounds were, there were a small group of children who had no sense of hearing sounds and words and finding out what letters to write down. And when you're writing, that's the task. You have to hear the sounds and the words, and in order to get to writing them. So you need to go from hearing the sounds to the letters. Now, when we were thinking about this and reading the literature, we found that a Russian psychologist, Del Konen, had given a fairly clear explanation about how you could teach preschool children to do this. So we adapted his method for the Reading Recovery program.
Well then, how do the boxes and the counters help?
Well, firstly, they show the child that the word does have parts. The poorest children can't hear any parts within a word. So both the boxes that you draw and the counters that you slowly push into them help the child to realise that the words have parts. the teacher and the child say the words slowly together, and first the teacher and later the child pushes the counters into the boxes, trying to separate the word into its parts and trying to learn how to do that. And so I think that the boxes and the counters emphasize the sound sequences in the words.
Now there's a shift then from what we talked about when we discussed the child writing a sentence much earlier, when he was able to hear the last sound and then the first sound in that order, to what we saw on the slide where we saw the little boy writing the story about the white puppy, where he wasn't able to move through the words in sequence and write and write the letters in that order.
It looked as though he'd written puppy from beginning to end, didn't it?
It did.
So he could start at the beginning and move through. Yes.
And that leads eventually?
Well, eventually they can do that sound analysis on their own as they write. Sometimes back in the classroom you'll see them drawing little boxes for themselves, but after a while they don't need the boxes anymore. Barbara, how does a teacher decide on a new book for a particular child?
Well, that's a very important decision, and probably one of the most important she has to make in relation to the lesson. She has got written records of what the child has been doing, her observations, and she has got running records. And she thinks very carefully about what the child can do and chooses a book that has got one or two new things in that are just ahead of where the child has been reading. So there are one or two new challenges in that book, and she makes sure that she chooses a book very carefully for that particular child. So it's a very careful decision, and at a time when she needs to take a lot of things into account to choose the next most appropriate book.
For that child, to stretch him, but to use what he already knows.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, what are some of the reasons that we introduce a new book? We're going to have to talk about introducing a new book.
Well, in that orientation time, the teacher tries to draw attention to a lot of things, depending on the particular book, of course. But she would want to give the child an idea of the total story, the whole story, the plot. Maybe she would draw attention to some of the main ideas, some particular concepts. She would want to use some of the language structures that may occur in that book in an oral form, talk with them as she's discussing the book with the child. Some particular special vocabulary maybe. And so the child has all of those things as he moves through the total book, because that introduction goes from the beginning of the book to the end, using the pictures to bring out all of those points.
Well, this total book must be a short story.
Yes, well, little books are used most of the time, but if it later on, as the child is becoming a more competent reader, the books do become longer, and sometimes the teacher may have to take that in two halves, but she'd introduce the whole book, then the reading would be half the book only.
Well, let me go back over that. The teacher will familiarise the child with the new things that he'll meet in the text, like the plot and where the story's going. It gives the child some idea of the whole task in front of him. You know, it gives him sort of direction and where he's trying to get to. But in addition to that, it gives him some of the vocabulary he's going to have to use, and even some of the sentence structures if they're a bit unusual. Okay. How about you illustrate that for us with a book? We haven't got a child here.
No, very difficult without a child, but let me see if I can
Some
move
of the
through. The teacher might do an introduction.
Right.
Well, she might start this way. This story's called Greedy Cat, and you can see him here with a greedy sort of look on his face, and he's eyeing that shopping bag, and this story's about all the things that happen in relation to that shopping bag with this greedy cat. Here's Mum going out shopping, and she gets some sausages here, and look who comes along. The person who wrote this story talked about the way that the greedy cat went gobble, 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 and that was the end of that as he got to those sausages. And here she's got some sticky buns from her shopping this time. And again, along came Greedy Cat, gobble, 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 and that was the end of that. You can see this story goes on. What do you think happens next? This time, yes, they bought some potato chips. Same thing again. Now she bought some bananas. And what does Greedy Cat do? And what does Greedy Cat say? Or what happens about Greedy Cat? You read it with me. Gobble, gobble, gobble. Show me where Gobble is. And then on through the story till we get here. Now, this time, Mother, look at her face. She's sick of this greedy cat, and she decides she's going to do something about this. So she buys pepper, and it's a pot of pepper, and pepper's very hot. You've probably had it sometimes. It burns your mouth if you eat it, and if you get it in your nose, you sniff it up, and it's awful. So Mum went shopping and got that, put it in the shopping bag, and look, in went greedy cat, but yow! You say that, yow! And that was the end of that. You read that. And that was the end of that.
This introduction then helps the child to keep the whole world of that story in his head while he's trying to read it for the first time, all right? And he's got some idea of the words he's going to meet, particularly the new ones, and the concepts like pepper, which you dealt with, and the language structure. What was that language structure at the end of the story?
And that was the end of that, and it occurs right through the story, actually, on every page.
The teacher is introducing Trevor to his new book here. The child will have a similar introduction to the greedy cat, and the child will be ready to read this book for the first time after the introduction. There's the child working his way independently through the book. And the teacher doesn't have to do very much, and this is the first time that he's reading it.
So there's a fostering of independence, but there's also some deliberate teaching, isn't there?
This is a critical time for the teacher to provide help at the first reading. She supports or cues the child so that he solves most of the story himself, and she encourages him to search and check, and she really wants him to be as independent as possible, and I think we can see that in this slide. Is it surprising that the child can read this new book the next day? He's had it introduced. He's read it through once. Is it surprising that he can read it the next day with better than 90% accuracy on most occasions?
No, because that book was very carefully chosen for that particular child. It uses what he already knows. And then there are just one or two new learning challenges in it. And then that introduction and first reading involve the best teaching that the teacher can give, with some deliberate teaching at certain points and so on. And the child knows he must do the reading work. And his past experience gives him a sense of control over reading books. And so he brings all of that to that second reading on a subsequent day.
The teacher's been making very detailed records of this lesson. She has something she calls a lesson plan, but she actually is writing down how the child was responding and what things were difficult and so on. And she took that running record of the reading. What does she do with those records?
Well, they're very important because you can't plan reading recovery lessons in advance because you're responding to the child and to the kinds of things that happen. But the teacher goes very carefully through those written records, analyses the running record for strategies and understanding that the child chose. She looks closely at her notes that she made during the lesson about the way the child responded on easy text, on the new book and so on. And she, out of that, draws emphases for the next lesson. And those emphases will help her into choosing the book that she's going to use. And so we move from those observations and those records into tomorrow's lesson.